The golden sunrise poured like molten ore over the dusty main street of Promise Creek as Willa Taylor stood frozen on the boardwalk, her heart threatening to burst from her chest at the sight of a ghost. Xander Pearson hadn't aged a day in 5 years, his tall figure still commanding attention as he dismounted from his chestnut stallion outside the saloon, unaware of her presence or the chaos his return was creating in her carefully reconstructed world. The year was 1876, and Promise Creek had grown from a whisper of a settlement to a respectable town in the Wyoming Territory. Willa had arrived 5 years prior, a 19-year-old with nothing but determination and a small inheritance from her late parents. Now, at 24, she owned the town's only bookshop, a modest success that had earned her respect if not wealth. "Merciful heavens," Martha Simmons whispered beside her, clutching Willa's arm. "Isn't that Xander Pearson? Everyone said he died in that Apache raid south of Santa Fe." "Everyone was wrong," Willa replied, unable to tear her gaze away from him. The man who had promised to return for her, who had vanished without a trace, whose memory she had locked away in the deepest chambers of her heart. Xander tied his horse to the hitching post with practiced ease. His shoulders were broader than she remembered, his skin bronzed by years under the relentless western sun. The boy who had left at 22 had returned a man of 27, with new lines etched around his eyes and a scar that sliced through his right eyebrow. "Are you all right, dear?" Martha asked, concern evident in her voice. "You've gone white as fresh linen." "I'm fine," Willa lied, gripping the wooden post beside her for support. "I just need a moment." "Of course he wouldn't recognize you now," Martha continued, oblivious to Willa's turmoil. "Your hair's different, you're a proper businesswoman. They said after that stage robbery when you lost everything, he'd forgotten all about his promise to you. Men like that, they drift with the wind." Willa barely heard her. 5 years ago, when the letter had come that Xander had been killed, something inside her had broken. She'd mourned him, buried her love for him alongside the memories of their stolen moments and whispered promises. She'd built walls around her heart, convinced herself that the pain would fade with time. She watched as he pushed through the swinging doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon, and only when he disappeared from view did she release the breath she'd been holding. "I should get back to the shop," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Martha patted her arm. "Of course, dear, don't let old ghosts trouble you. You've made something of yourself here." Willa nodded and headed back to her bookshop, the written word, her sanctuary in this dusty frontier town. She unlocked the door with trembling fingers, breathing in the comforting scent of paper and leather bindings. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside, and she allowed herself a moment of peace before lighting the lamps. Morning light filtered through the front windows, illuminating the neat shelves and the small reading area she'd created with 2 comfortable chairs and a small table. She busied herself with unpacking a new shipment of books that had arrived on yesterday's stage, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of checking inventory and arranging displays. But her mind kept returning to Xander, to the shock of seeing him alive after all this time. The bell jingled again just before noon, and Willa looked up from her ledger with a practiced smile that froze on her face when she saw who stood in her doorway. Xander Pearson filled the frame, his hat in his hands, those familiar hazel eyes widening in recognition. "Willa," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. The ledger slipped from her fingers, landing with a thud on the counter. "You're supposed to be dead," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I nearly was," he replied, taking a hesitant step forward. "More than once." Willa straightened her spine, summoning every ounce of composure she possessed. "What are you doing here, Xander?" He looked around the shop, taking in the shelves of books, the small desk where she kept her accounts. "They told me at the saloon that Promise Creek had a bookshop now." "I had to see for myself." His lips curved into a small smile. "Should have known it would be you. You always did love your books." "You didn't answer my question," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. Xander ran a hand through his dark hair, longer now than when she'd last seen him. "I've been searching for you, Willa, for 3 years, ever since I was well enough to travel. 3 years." The words escaped before she could stop them. "You've been alive for 3 years and never thought to send word," pain flashed across his face. "I tried." I wrote letters from every town I passed through, but you weren't in Silverdale anymore. No one knew where you'd gone. Willa's hands clenched into fists at her sides. After the stage robbery, after I lost everything, after I thought you were dead, I had to start somewhere new. I know that now. He took another step forward, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, smell the leather of his jacket and the dust of the trail. I've been riding from town to town, following rumors, asking questions. Some said you'd gone back east. Others said you'd married a rancher in Montana Territory. And you believed them. No, he said simply. Because you're written on my soul, Willa Taylor. I would have searched until my dying day. The words struck her like physical blows. Words she had once dreamed of hearing, now arriving too late after too much pain. It's been 5 years, Xander, she said quietly. I mourned you. I built a life without you. I understand, he said, though the pain in his eyes suggested otherwise. I just needed to see you to know you were all right. I am all right, she said, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. I have my shop, my friends. I've made a place for myself here. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her face. You look beautiful, Willa, different but beautiful. She touched her hair self-consciously. Gone were the long auburn curls he had once loved to wind around his fingers. She wore it shorter now, practical for a businesswoman with just a hint of wave framing her face. What happened to you? She asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Xander glanced at the chairs in the reading area. Could we sit? It's a long story. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded and led him to the reading corner. She sat primly on the edge of one chair while he lowered himself into the other, placing his hat on the small table between them. The Apache raid was real, he began, his voice low. I was guiding a survey party for the railroad when we were attacked. Most of the men were killed outright. I took an arrow in the shoulder, another in my leg. I should have died there. Willa tried to keep her expression neutral, but the thought of him bleeding in the desert sent a sharp pain through her chest. A band of Comanche found me, barely alive. They took me to their village where their medicine man treated my wounds. I was delirious with fever for weeks. When I finally came to my senses, I couldn't walk, couldn't even stand without help. The Comanche helped you? She asked, surprise evident in her voice. He nodded. Not all tribes were hostile. These people had a peace agreement with the local settlement. The medicine man had learned some Western medicine from a missionary. Between that and their traditional healing, they saved my life. But it took 2 years before you started looking for me. It took that long before I could ride again, he said, a shadow crossing his face. The arrow in my leg had damaged the muscle. I had to learn to walk all over again, and my shoulder. He rotated it unconsciously. It still aches before rain. Willa's anger began to soften despite her best efforts. Why didn't you send word once you were with the Comanche? Surely messengers traveled between their village and the settlements. I tried, he said, leaning forward earnestly. I wrote a letter and gave it to a trader heading to Santa Fe, but later I learned he was robbed and killed on the trail. I wrote another and sent it with a missionary, but by then, nearly a year had passed. When no reply came, I wrote again and again. Nothing. They never reached me, Willa said, a coldness settling in her stomach at the thought of those lost letters, those missed chances. When I was strong enough, I rode to Silverdale, he continued. But you were gone. Your aunt's house had new owners who knew nothing about you. I spent months tracking down anyone who might have known you, following every lead. My aunt died, Willa said quietly. A month after I received word of your death. The house had to be sold to pay her debts. I had nothing left in Silverdale. Xander's expression softened with sorrow. I'm sorry, Willa. I know how much she meant to you. An uncomfortable silence fell between them, 5 years of separation stretching like an unbridgeable chasm. Are you staying in Promise Creek? She finally asked, unsure which answer she feared more. I don't know, he admitted. I've been chasing a ghost for so long, I never thought about what I'd do when I found you. The bell above the door jingled again, saving her from having to respond. A customer entered and Willa rose quickly, grateful for the interruption. I should get back to work, she said, smoothing her skirts. Xander stood, towering over her as he always had. Could I call on you, properly, I mean, perhaps dinner tomorrow? Every instinct warned her to refuse, to protect the life she had built, the heart she had mended. But looking into his eyes, she found herself nodding. I close the shop at 6. A smile broke across his face, transforming him into the young man she had loved so desperately. "I'll be here." After he left, Willa helped her customer find a copy of Dickens, her mind elsewhere, her heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. She had trained herself not to think of Xander Pearson. Now, suddenly, he was all she could think about. That evening, as she locked up the shop and walked to her small house on the edge of town, she found herself looking over her shoulder, half expecting to see him following. But the streets were quiet, the setting sun painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple. Her home was modest but comfortable: 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a small parlor with bookshelves lining every wall. She had worked hard for this place, saving every penny, building a life from the ashes of her old one. As she prepared a simple dinner, she couldn't help but wonder where Xander was staying, what he was doing. Was he thinking of her as she was thinking of him? She tried to focus on practical matters. What would she wear tomorrow? What would they talk about? How could she protect herself from falling under his spell again? Sleep eluded her that night. She tossed and turned, memories flooding back unbidden. Their first meeting at a church social in Silverdale, his courtship, respectful but persistent. Their first kiss, stolen in her aunt's garden beneath a harvest moon. The way he had looked at her the day he left for that surveying job, promising to return with enough money to marry her properly. Morning came too soon, bringing with it a day that seemed to crawl and race simultaneously. Every time the bell above her shop door rang, her heart leaped, though she knew Xander wouldn't return until evening. At 5:30, she closed the ledger and went to the small washroom at the back of the shop to freshen up. She had chosen her dress carefully that morning, a deep blue that brought out her eyes, modest but flattering. Just as the town clock struck 6, the bell jingled and Xander stepped into the shop. He had cleaned up, his hair still damp from washing, his clothes fresh. He held a small bouquet of wildflowers in one hand. "You're punctual," she said, unable to keep a small smile from her lips. "Some things haven't changed," he replied, offering her the flowers. "These reminded me of the ones that grew behind your aunt's house." Willa took them, their fingers brushing briefly. "Thank you, they're lovely. I've reserved a table at the hotel dining room," he said. "I hope that's acceptable." The Central Hotel housed the finest restaurant in Promise Creek, a place Willa rarely visited. "That's very thoughtful." She locked the shop, and they walked side by side down the main street, not touching, a respectable distance between them. But Willa was acutely aware of his presence, of the sidelong glances from townspeople who noted their passage with undisguised interest. "I think we're causing quite a stir," Xander murmured, amusement coloring his voice. "Small towns thrive on gossip," she replied. "By morning we'll be engaged according to some and mortal enemies according to others." He laughed, the sound warming something long cold inside her. "And which would you prefer?" The question, lightly asked, carried unexpected weight. "Neither," she said carefully. "The truth is complicated enough." The hotel dining room was elegant by frontier standards, with white tablecloths and glass oil lamps that cast a warm glow over the wooden tables. A few other diners looked up as they entered, curiosity evident on their faces. The waiter seated them at a corner table, relatively private compared to the others. Xander held Willa's chair for her, a gesture that felt both familiar and strange after so many years. "How long have you had the bookshop?" he asked after they had ordered. 3 years, she replied. "I worked at the general store when I first arrived, saving every penny. When old Mr. Hanson decided to sell his stationery shop, I saw an opportunity." "It suits you," Xander said, his eyes warm. "I remember how you always had a book tucked away somewhere, even at social gatherings." The fact that he remembered such a small detail about her sent an unwelcome flutter through her chest. "And you, what have you been doing since you recovered?" A shadow crossed his face. "Odd jobs, mostly, ranch work, some scouting for the army, whatever would earn enough to keep searching for you. And now that you've found me," the question slipped out before she could stop it. He met her gaze steadily. "That depends on you, Willa." Their food arrived, saving her from having to respond. They ate in silence for a few moments, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. "I heard about what happened," Xander finally said. "The stage robbery, that you lost everything you had." Willa's hand tightened around her fork. That day remained vivid in her memory, the crash as the stagecoach overturned, the masked men demanding valuables, the terror as they discovered she carried her aunt's entire estate in banknotes. It was a difficult time, she said simply. You could have been killed. But I wasn't, she countered, and I learned an important lesson about self-reliance. You were always independent, he said with a small smile, even when we were courting. I had to be, she replied. After losing my parents, then thinking I'd lost you, his expression sobered. I'm so sorry, Willa, if I could have spared you that pain. But you couldn't, she said, more sharply than she intended, just as I couldn't spare you yours. He reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of hers. I don't blame you for being angry, you have every right. I'm not angry, she said, then sighed at his skeptical look. Well, perhaps a little, but mostly I'm confused. Everything I thought I knew has changed in an instant. I understand, he said softly. When I learned you'd left Silverdale, that no one knew where you'd gone, I felt the same way. Their conversation turned to safer topics as they finished their meal. Xander told her about the places he'd seen in his search for her, from the rugged mountains of Colorado to the sprawling plains of Kansas. Willa spoke of Promise Creek, of building her business, of the friends she'd made. By the time they finished dessert, the dining room had emptied of other patrons. The waiter discreetly brought their bill, which Xander insisted on paying despite Willa's protest. Please, he said, allow me this small courtesy. Outside, the night had deepened, stars scattered across the velvet sky. The air was cool, and Willa shivered slightly in her light shawl. May I walk you home? Xander asked. She hesitated only briefly before nodding. They walked in companionable silence, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalks. Main Street was quiet at this hour, most businesses closed, only the saloons still bright with light and noise. It's not far, Willa said as they turned onto Maple Street, lined with modest homes. Just at the end of the block. It's a nice neighborhood, Xander observed. Peaceful, it is, she agreed. Mrs. Hollister next door keeps chickens. She brings me eggs every Sunday, and Mr. Jenkins across the street is a carpenter. He built my bookshelves in exchange for teaching his daughter to read. They reached her gate, and Willa turned to face him. Thank you for dinner. It was pleasant, he repeated with a small smile. Faint praise, but I'll take it. In the moonlight, his features were softened, reminiscent of the young man she had loved. Before she could reconsider, she asked, Would you like to come in for coffee? Surprise flickered across his face, followed by warmth. I'd like that very much. Willa led him up the short path to her front porch, unlocked the door, and lit the lamp in the entryway. The familiar surroundings steadied her nerves as she invited him to sit in the parlor while she prepared the coffee. In the kitchen, as she measured grounds and heated water, she questioned her own judgment. Inviting a man into her home at this hour would set tongues wagging, even if he was an old acquaintance. But Xander wasn't just any man, and their history wasn't something that could be neatly categorized. When she returned with 2 cups of coffee, she found him examining her bookshelves, a volume of Tennyson's poetry in his hands. You still have it, he said, holding up the book. I gave this to you for your 18th birthday. Willa set the coffee tray on the small table. Yes, she admitted. I couldn't bring myself to part with it, even when I thought you were gone. He returned the book to its place and joined her on the settee, careful to maintain a proper distance. Thank you for the coffee and for inviting me in. I have questions, she said directly, taking a sip from her cup. Things I need to understand. Xander nodded, his expression serious. Ask anything, I have no secrets from you, Willa. Why didn't you try to send a message through the army or a telegraph once you reached civilization? I did, he said, setting his cup down. When I finally reached Fort Benson, I sent telegrams to Silverdale, but by then you had already left. No one knew where to forward them. And now, she asked, the question that had been haunting her since his appearance. What are your intentions, Xander? He met her gaze steadily. My intentions haven't changed, Willa. I love you. I never stopped. If you'll have me, I want to build a life with you. But I understand that time has passed, that you've changed, that I've changed. 5 years is a long time, she said softly. We're not the same people we were. No, he agreed. But I believe that the essential parts of us, the parts that recognized something special in each other, those haven't changed. Willa set her cup down, her hands trembling slightly. I've worked so hard to forget you to move forward, and now you're here and everything I've built feels precarious. I would never ask you to give up what you've worked for, he said earnestly. Your shop, your home, these are testaments to your strength and determination. I admire what you've accomplished, Willa. And what of your life, she asked. You've been wandering for years. Could you settle in Promise Creek? What would you do? A small smile played at his lips. I've been thinking about that. There's talk of extending the railroad this way. They'll need surveyors, men who know the territory. It's work I'm good at. Dangerous work, she couldn't help saying. Less so than riding alone from town to town searching for a ghost, he countered. And it would give me a reason to stay, to build something permanent. The thought of Xander settling in Promise Creek, of seeing him daily, sent a flutter of both anticipation and fear through her. I need time, Xander. This is all so sudden. He nodded, no trace of disappointment in his expression. Of course, I've waited 3 years to find you. I can wait for you to decide what you want. They finished their coffee, the conversation turning to memories of Silverdale, of mutual acquaintances, of simpler times. When the mantel clock struck 10, Xander rose to leave. May I call on you again? He asked at the door. Willa hesitated only briefly. Yes, she said. Perhaps Sunday. After church, his smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I'll be there. After he left, Willa leaned against the closed door, her emotions in turmoil. She had spent years convincing herself that Xander Pearson was a chapter of her life that had closed. Now the book had been reopened, and she wasn't sure she was ready to read what came next. The next few days passed in a blur of routine tasks and racing thoughts. Willa attended to her customers, ordered new stock, balanced her accounts, all while replaying her conversations with Xander in her mind. On Saturday, Martha Simmons visited the bookshop, ostensibly to purchase a birthday gift for her nephew, but clearly bursting with curiosity. I hear you dined with Xander Pearson at the Central, she said, examining a copy of Treasure Island with far more attention than it warranted. News travels fast, Willa replied dryly. It's not every day a man returns from the dead, Martha said. Especially one as handsome as Mr. Pearson, and to think after all this time he was looking for you. Willa shelved a stack of ledgers, avoiding Martha's eager gaze. We were once acquainted, that's all. Martha's eyebrows rose. That's not what Mrs. Peterson at the hotel said. According to her, he couldn't take his eyes off you all evening. Heat rose to Willa's cheeks. Mrs. Peterson should mind her own business. Oh, don't be cross, Martha said with a laugh. It's romantic, like something from a novel, the long-lost lover returning, having never forgotten his true love. Life isn't a novel, Martha, Willa said, more sharply than she intended. Real people don't simply pick up where they left off after 5 years. Martha's expression softened. No, I suppose they don't, but sometimes life gives second chances. My Henry and I were separated for 2 years during the war. When he came back, we had to get to know each other all over again. And did you? Get to know each other again, we did, Martha said with a gentle smile. It wasn't easy. He'd seen terrible things and I'd had to manage everything alone, but the foundation was still there, the love that had brought us together in the first place. Willa considered her friend's words long after Martha had left with her nephew's gift. Was there still a foundation between her and Xander, or had time and circumstances eroded it beyond repair? Sunday dawned clear and bright, the kind of autumn day that hinted at winter's approach without surrendering summer's warmth. Willa dressed with care for church, selecting a sage green dress that complemented her auburn hair and fair complexion. The small wooden church on the hill overlooking Promise Creek was filled to capacity when she arrived. She slipped into her usual pew, nodding greetings to familiar faces. Her heart skipped when she saw Xander seated near the back, his dark head bowed in prayer. Throughout the service, she was painfully aware of his presence. Twice she caught him watching her, his gaze intense and unwavering. When the final hymn ended and the congregation began to disperse, she remained in her seat, allowing the crowd to thin before she made her way outside. Xander was waiting at the bottom of the church steps, his hat in his hands. He had dressed formally in a dark suit, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. "Good morning," he said as she approached. "You look lovely." "Thank you," she replied, conscious of the curious glances from other churchgoers. "You clean up well yourself." His smile was warm, reaching his eyes. I thought we might walk to the river if you're agreeable. It's a beautiful day. The river path was a popular Sunday destination for the residents of Promise Creek, public enough to be proper, yet offering pockets of privacy for conversation. Willa nodded her assent and they set off, matching their pace to the leisurely stroll of other couples and families headed in the same direction. "Did you enjoy the sermon?" Xander asked as they walked, his hands clasped behind his back. "Reverend Collins is rather fond of fire and brimstone," Willa said with a small smile, "but his heart is in the right place. I found his passion refreshing after some of the sermons I've heard in my travels. There was a preacher in Kansas who could put a roomful of cowboys to sleep in under 5 minutes." Willa laughed, the sound surprising her. How long had it been since she'd laughed freely? "That takes considerable talent, indeed. I think even the horses dozed off." They reached the river path, which wound along the banks of the Promise River, shaded by cottonwood trees that were just beginning to turn gold with autumn's touch. The water flowed clear and swift, catching the sunlight in dancing patterns. "This reminds me of the creek behind your aunt's house," Xander said as they paused to watch a pair of ducks glide across the water. "I thought the same thing when I first saw it," Willa admitted. "It's one of the reasons I decided to stay in Promise Creek." "What were the others?" She considered the question. "The people, I suppose. After the stage robbery, when I arrived here with nothing but the clothes on my back, they took me in. Mrs. Jenkins at the boarding house gave me a room at half price until I found work. Sheriff Davis tracked down the robbers and recovered a small portion of my money. It wasn't much, but it was a start." "I'm glad you weren't alone," Xander said softly. "That's what haunted me most, the thought of you facing hardship with no one to turn to." "I learned to rely on myself," she said, looking out over the water. "It wasn't easy, but it made me stronger." "I can see that," he replied. "You've built something remarkable, Willa. I'm proud of you." His simple words of praise touched her more deeply than elaborate compliments might have. They continued walking, finding a fallen log where they could sit and watch the river flow by. "Tell me about the Comanche," Willa said after a comfortable silence. "What was it like living with them?" Xander's expression grew thoughtful. "Different from anything I'd known. They live by different rules, different values. Family is everything to them, not just blood relations, but the entire tribe. They took me in, a stranger, an enemy by most accounts, and treated me as one of their own." "Did you learn their language?" "Some," he said with a smile. "Enough to get by. Their medicine man, Tall Oak, spoke some English. He taught me their healing practices in exchange for stories about the outside world." "It sounds as though you admired them," she observed. "I did, still do. They're not the savages people make them out to be. They're fighting for their way of life, for their very survival." Willa had never heard anyone speak of the native tribes with such respect. "Yet you left them." "I had to," he said simply. "My heart was elsewhere, with you." The directness of his statement caught her off guard. Before she could respond, a group of children ran past, laughing and shouting as they chased each other along the riverbank. "Do you ever think about having a family?" Xander asked, watching the children with a wistful expression. The question stirred something deep within her, dreams she had carefully packed away years ago. "Sometimes," she admitted. "When I was younger, I imagined 2 or 3 children, a house filled with laughter and books. And now," she sighed softly, "now I wonder if those dreams belong to a different Willa, one who hasn't seen how quickly happiness can be snatched away." Xander's hand found hers on the log between them, his touch gentle. "Not all happiness is fleeting, Willa." She looked down at their joined hands, at how right it felt despite the years and miles that had separated them. "Isn't it? My parents, my aunt, you, I learned to stop counting on forever. Yet here I am," he said, his voice low and intense. "Not a ghost, not a memory. Flesh and blood and still in love with you." Willa's heart stumbled at his declaration. "Xander, you don't have to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I know you need time. I know trust, once broken, isn't easily repaired, but I want you to know that my feelings haven't changed. If anything, they've deepened with time and distance." She found herself unable to withdraw her hand from his, unwilling to break the connection that felt both new and familiar. "I don't know what I feel anymore," she confessed. "When I thought you were dead, I locked away that part of my heart. Opening it again feels dangerous." "I understand," he said, gently squeezing her fingers. But know this, Willa Taylor, I'm not going anywhere this time. Whatever you decide, I'll be here. You won't lose me again." They sat in silence for a while longer, hand in hand, watching the river flow by. The simple connection, the warmth of his palm against hers, spoke volumes that words could not express. As the sun began its westward descent, they walked back toward town. Xander escorted her to her house, declining her invitation to come in for tea with obvious reluctance. "I have an early meeting at the railroad office tomorrow," he explained. "They're considering my application for the surveying position." "I hope it goes well," she said, meaning it. The thought of him settling in Promise Creek no longer filled her with dread, but with a cautious hope she hardly dared acknowledge. "Thank you," he said, his eyes warm. "May I call on you tomorrow evening to share the news, whatever it may be?" She nodded. "I'd like that." He hesitated, then lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Until tomorrow, Willa." She watched him walk away, her hand still tingling from the touch of his lips. Something was changing between them, shifting like sand beneath her feet. The walls she had built around her heart were beginning to crumble, and she wasn't sure whether to reinforce them or let them fall. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Willa found herself checking the clock every few minutes, distracted from her work by thoughts of Xander and his meeting with the railroad officials. Would he get the position? Would he stay in Promise Creek regardless? What would it mean for them if he did? When the shop door opened just after 5 o'clock, she looked up expectantly, only to find Sheriff Davis standing in the doorway. "Evening, Miss Taylor," he said, removing his hat. "Got a minute, of course, Sheriff," she replied, setting aside the inventory list she'd been pretending to review. "What can I help you with?" The sheriff approached the counter, his expression grave. "It's about Xander Pearson," Willa's heart seized. "What about him? He had some trouble at the saloon last night, after he left you, I reckon." "Got into a fight with a fella named Maddox, one of the railroad contractors." "A fight?" Willa repeated, struggling to reconcile the image with the gentle man who had kissed her hand so reverently just hours earlier. "Was anyone hurt?" "Maddox took the worst of it," Sheriff Davis said. "Broken nose, bruised ribs, nothing that won't heal, but there's talk that Pearson might lose his chance at that surveying job because of it." "That's terrible," Willa said, her mind racing. "But why are you telling me this, Sheriff?" Davis shifted uncomfortably. "Well, madam, the thing is, the fight was about you." "Me?" she echoed, her voice rising in surprise. "According to witnesses, Maddox made some unsavory remarks about your relationship with Pearson. Suggested it wasn't proper for a respectable businesswoman to be seen with a drifter of questionable reputation." Heat rose to Willa's cheeks, partly from embarrassment, partly from indignation. "And Xander defended my honor." "That's the size of it," the sheriff confirmed. "Threw the first punch by all accounts. I'm not pressing charges. Maddox was asking for it, and everyone knows it. But I thought you should hear it from me before the gossips got hold of it." "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I appreciate your discretion." After Davis left, Willa closed the shop early, her mind in turmoil. Xander had risked his chance at employment, his reputation in town, to defend her name. It was reckless, perhaps even foolish, but undeniably chivalrous in a way that reminded her of the young man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. She was still pondering this development when a knock came at her door that evening. She opened it to find Xander standing on her porch, a small purple bruise darkening his left cheekbone, his expression a mixture of determination and apprehension. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," he said by way of greeting. "I assume Sheriff Davis spoke with you?" "He did," she confirmed, stepping aside to let him enter. "You should have told me yourself." Xander followed her into the parlor, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "I was planning to. I didn't want that to be the first thing we discussed tonight." "And the meeting with the railroad officials?" she asked, gesturing for him to sit. "Did your altercation with Mr. Maddox affect their decision?" A hint of a smile played at his lips. "As it happens, Mr. Hargrove, the chief engineer, has a particular dislike for Maddox. He seemed to think any man who would blacken his eye was showing good judgment." Relief washed over her. "So you got the position?" "I did," he confirmed, his smile broadening. "Starting next week, I'll be leading a survey team along the proposed route west of town. It's temporary at first, but if all goes well, they're looking to establish a permanent office here." "That's wonderful news, Xander," she said sincerely. "Though I wish it hadn't come at the cost of a brawl in the saloon." His smile faded. "I'm not proud of losing my temper, Willa, but the things he said about you," he shook his head. "I couldn't let them stand." "Words can't harm me," she said gently. "I've heard worse since opening my shop." "Not everyone approves of a woman in business." "I know," he sighed. "And I know you're perfectly capable of defending yourself, but when I heard him speak your name with such disrespect," his hands clenched into fists at the memory. Something in me snapped. Willa studied him, this man who had traveled so far to find her, who had defended her honor without hesitation. Despite her best efforts to maintain emotional distance, she found herself moving to sit beside him on the settee. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not for the fighting that was foolish, but for caring enough to be angry on my behalf." Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to charge with unspoken feelings. Xander reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw, and when she didn't, he cupped her cheek in his palm. "I will always care, Willa," he murmured. "Always." She leaned into his touch, allowing herself this moment of vulnerability. "I've been so afraid," she whispered. "Afraid to believe, afraid to hope, afraid to trust that this is real." "It's real," he assured her, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone. "I'm real, and I'm not going anywhere." Later, she would never be certain who moved first. But suddenly his lips were on hers, gentle yet insistent, familiar yet new, and she was kissing him back, her hands clutching the lapels of his jacket as if to anchor herself against a storm of emotion. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Xander rested his forehead against hers. "I've dreamed of that every night for 5 years," he confessed, "but the reality is infinitely sweeter." Willa's heart raced, a mixture of exhilaration and terror flooding her veins. "Xander, This is happening so fast." He pulled back slightly, searching her face. "Too fast? I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me feels like we're picking up a conversation interrupted 5 years ago. Another part feels like we're strangers." "We have time," he said, taking her hands in his. "I'm not asking for promises tonight, Willa. Just a chance to show you that what we had, what we could have again, is worth the risk." She looked into his eyes, those hazel eyes that had haunted her dreams, and found herself nodding. "A chance," she agreed softly. "That's a good place to start." The weeks that followed took on a rhythm that felt both new and nostalgic. Xander's work with the railroad survey team kept him busy during daylight hours, but most evenings found him at Willa's shop or her home, sharing stories of his day or simply helping her shelve books and tally accounts. On Sundays, they attended church together, then often joined other couples for communal picnics or walks along the river. Slowly, the townspeople of Promise Creek adjusted to seeing them as a pair, the initial flurry of gossip giving way to acceptance. Willa found herself opening up to Xander a little more each day, sharing the small triumphs and trials of her years without him. He listened with unwavering attention, never rushing her, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. In turn, he told her of his time with the Comanche, of the lessons he had learned about patience and resilience, of the long journey that had led him back to her. Some nights, when the memories grew too dark or painful, he would fall silent, and Willa would simply sit beside him, offering the comfort of her presence until the shadows receded. One evening in late October, as they sat on her front porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of amber and gold, Xander took her hand in his. "There's something I want to show you," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "If you're willing to ride out to the ridge tomorrow morning." "The ridge," Willa repeated, curious. "What's there?" "Something I've been working on," he said cryptically. "During my free time." Her curiosity piqued, she agreed. The next morning, wearing her practical riding skirt and jacket, she met Xander at the livery stable where he had arranged for 2 horses. "It's not far," he assured her as he helped her mount a gentle mare. "Just beyond the eastern ridge, about an hour's ride." The day was perfect for riding, crisp and clear, with just enough warmth in the sun to keep the autumn chill at bay. They rode side by side when the trail allowed, Xander pointing out landmarks and sharing his knowledge of the territory he had been surveying. As they crested the ridge, Willa gasped at the panorama spread before them. The valley below, carpeted in golden grasses and scattered pines, with the Promise River winding like a silver ribbon through its heart. "It's beautiful," she breathed, reining in her horse to admire the view. It is, Xander agreed, but that's not what I brought you to see. Come on, just a little further. He led her down a gentle slope, following a narrow trail that wound between stands of aspen and pine. After another quarter-mile, they emerged into a small clearing overlooking the valley. In the center of the clearing stood the skeleton of a cabin, the foundation and frame complete, the walls partially raised. Xander, Willa questioned, dismounting and approaching the structure. What is this? He tied their horses to a nearby tree and came to stand beside her, his expression a mixture of pride and uncertainty. It's a beginning, he said, or at least I hope it could be. She walked around the perimeter of the cabin, noting the solid craftsmanship, the carefully positioned windows that would capture both morning and evening light. You built this, she asked, running her hand along a smooth planed beam. With some help from Jenkins and his sons, Xander admitted. I've been working on it every moment I could spare from the railroad job. But why? She asked, though a part of her already knew the answer. Xander took a deep breath, then reached for her hands. Because I wanted to show you that I'm serious about staying, about building a future here. About building a future with you if you'll have me. Willa looked from the cabin to the man before her, her heart racing. Xander, it's not much yet, he continued quickly, but it will have 3 bedrooms, 1 for us and 2 for, well, for whatever the future might bring. A large front room with space for as many bookshelves as you could want, a proper kitchen with a view of the valley. You've thought of everything, she said softly. I've had 5 years to think about it, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. 5 years to imagine the life we might have had, the life we still could have. Willa walked to what would become the front of the cabin, where a porch would eventually stand, offering a breathtaking view of the valley below. It's perfect, Xander, it truly is. He came to stand beside her, his expression cautiously hopeful. Does that mean? She turned to face him, her heart full to bursting. It means I'm ready to stop being afraid, ready to believe in us again. Joy flooded his features. Willa, are you saying? I'm saying I love you, she said, the words falling from her lips like water breaking through a dam. I tried to stop, I tried to forget, but you were right, you're written on my soul, Xander Pearson. He gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his exuberance. Say it again, he whispered as he set her down. I love you, she repeated, laughing through tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. I never stopped loving you. His kiss was tender, reverent, a promise and a prayer. When they broke apart, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. I've been carrying this for a very long time, he said, tipping a ring into his palm. It was a simple band of gold with a single pearl nestled in its center. It was my mother's. I had it with me when I left for that surveying job 5 years ago. I was planning to ask you when I returned. Willa's breath caught as he knelt before her, there in the shadow of the cabin he was building for their future. Willa Taylor, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Yes, she whispered, and then louder, yes, Xander, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if it had been made for her. Then he rose and kissed her again, with all the passion and promise of a love that had survived separation, loss, and the test of time. They married on a clear December day in the Promise Creek Church, with Reverend Collins officiating and the entire town in attendance. Willa wore a gown of ivory satin with a lace overlay that Martha had helped her select, and carried a bouquet of winter roses and pine boughs. Xander, resplendent in a new black suit, watched with undisguised adoration as she walked down the aisle toward him. When they exchanged vows, his voice rang out strong and clear, a stark contrast to the tears that glimmered in his eyes. I, Xander, take you, Willa, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death us do part. I, Willa, take you, Xander, to be my lawfully wedded husband. Her voice caught as the enormity of the moment washed over her. Here was the man she had mourned, returned to her against all odds, promising her a lifetime of love. To have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death us do part. The celebration afterward was joyous, with music and dancing in the town hall, decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the Christmas season. Willa danced until her feet ached, not only with her new husband but with Sheriff Davis, Mr. Jenkins, and even old Mr. Hargrove from the railroad. "You look radiant, Mrs. Pearson," Xander murmured as they finally escaped the festivities, climbing into the wagon that would take them to their partially completed cabin. They had decided to spend their first night as husband and wife there, despite its unfinished state. The essential rooms were complete, the roof sound, and a fire had been prepared in the hearth. "I'm happy, Mr. Pearson," she replied, leaning against his shoulder as he guided the horses through the starlit night. "Happier than I ever thought possible." At the cabin, Xander lifted her from the wagon and carried her across the threshold, setting her down gently in the front room. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting a warm glow over the simple furnishings. A table and chairs, a settee and shelves already beginning to fill with books. "Welcome home," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Willa turned slowly, taking in what they had created together over the past weeks. The cabin was far from finished. There were still walls to complete, floors to sand, countless details to attend to. But it was theirs, a physical manifestation of the future they were building. "It's beautiful," she said, moving to stand before the fire, warming her hands. "Everything I could have wished for." Xander came to stand behind her, his arms encircling her waist. "We have the rest of our lives to make it perfect," he murmured, pressing a kiss to the sensitive spot below her ear. Willa turned in his embrace, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. "Do you know what today is?" she asked softly. He tilted his head, considering. "December 15th. Our wedding day. 5 years ago today," she said, "you rode out of Silverdale with the survey party. It was the last time I saw you until you walked into my bookshop in October." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "A circle completed," he said, "an ending become a beginning." "Exactly," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. "They said you were forgotten, but you were always written on my soul." Their kiss deepened, years of longing and months of restraint giving way to a passion that had only grown stronger through separation and reunion. That night, in the shelter of their half-built home, they reclaimed each other fully, body and soul, sealing their vows with the most ancient of promises. In the months that followed, they settled into the rhythm of married life with surprising ease. Willa continued to run her bookshop in town, while Xander's work with the railroad expanded to include managing the newly established district office. Together, they finished their cabin, adding a porch where they could sit and watch the sunset, bookshelves that reached to the ceiling, curtains that Willa sewed from fabric ordered from Chicago. Spring brought wildflowers to the clearing around their home, and with them, news that expanded their joy exponentially. Willa was expecting a child. "A baby," Xander whispered in wonder, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." "Due in November," she confirmed, her eyes shining with happiness. "Just in time for our first anniversary." As Willa's belly swelled with new life, their cabin echoed with the sounds of preparation. A cradle being built by Xander's steady hands, lullabies practiced in Willa's sweet voice, plans and dreams shared in the quiet hours of night. On a crisp November morning, after a labor that tested the limits of her endurance, Willa gave birth to a daughter with Xander's hazel eyes and her own auburn hair. "She's perfect," Xander breathed, cradling the tiny bundle with reverent hands. "Absolutely perfect. What shall we call her?" Willa asked, exhausted but radiant. Xander considered the infant's delicate features, already showing signs of the beauty she would one day possess. "Hope," he suggested. "Because that's what she represents, the hope that brought us back together, the hope that carried us through the darkness." "Hope Pearson," Willa tested the name and found it fitting. "Our little miracle." As winter settled over Promise Creek once more, the Pearson household glowed with warmth and light. The bookshop, now managed by a capable assistant when Willa needed time at home, continued to thrive. Xander's position with the railroad became permanent, affording them stability without sacrificing his love of the open country. On Christmas Eve, with baby Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Willa and Xander sat before the fire in their completed home, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it," Willa said, her head resting on her husband's shoulder. That you're really here, that we have this life together. Believe it, Xander replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. I crossed mountains and deserts to find you again. Nothing could have kept me away. When did you know? She asked, a question that had lingered in her mind. When did you know for certain that I was still out there, waiting to be found? Xander was silent for a moment, his fingers idly stroking her hair. It wasn't a matter of knowing, he finally said. It was a matter of faith. Even when everyone told me to give up, when they said you were forgotten, lost to me forever, I couldn't stop searching. Because you were never forgotten, Willa. You were written on my soul. Willa lifted her face to his, her eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper, something eternal. And you on mine, she whispered, always and forever. Their kiss was a promise renewed, a bond strengthened by the trials they had endured and the joy they had found in each other. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white, while inside, surrounded by the family they had created, Willa and Xander Pearson celebrated the miracle of a love that had transcended time, distance, and even death itself. In the years that followed, the legend of Xander and Willa Pearson would become part of Promise Creek's folklore. The cowboy who refused to believe his love was lost, the woman who built a life while carrying the memory of him in her heart. Their story would be told to generations of children as proof that true love, once written on the soul, can never truly be forgotten. And in a cabin on the ridge, where wildflowers bloomed in spring and snow gathered in winter, their love continued to grow, a testament to the enduring power of hope, faith, and the unbreakable bond between two souls destined to find each other, no matter the odds.